In just under 5 hours, South Australia will enter into the toughest restrictions faced anywhere in the country during the coronavirus pandemic. Everyone in the state will be forced to stay at home, just one person per home allowed out each day and only for essential supplies. The only exemptions, critical services such as supermarkets and public transport. Schools will close and no one can leave home to walk or exercise. The Premier is urging South Australians to rise to the challenge, saying it's the circuit breaker we need to prevent a second wave. 2 more cases were confirmed today, bringing the Parafield cluster to 22. But it's the rapid spread in people who aren't showing symptoms that has authorities most worried. It's taking less than 24 hours for people to become infectious after catching the strain. Unlike Victoria, it's hoped South Australia's restrictions will be short-lived. If things go to plan, it will be just 6 days. But it could be longer if the measures don't work. We have reporters Stacey Lee, Claire Campbell and Richard Davies at locations across Adelaide this evening to bring us the latest updates. Over to you first, Stacey. Almost as soon as the lockdown was announced, we saw a surge of people to supermarkets and bottle shops. Has that eased in any way yet?
Not really, Jess. We saw scenes of chaos earlier in the day. The line here at this supermarket at Carolta Park isn't too bad. Earlier in the day it was snaking right around the block, but it does seem to be moving pretty quickly as people try to get here to stock up on supplies to sustain themselves for the next 6 days. As we know, the first time around, South Australia didn't even really have what many people around the rest of the country would describe as a lockdown. We were still allowed to leave the house and restaurants and cafes were still allowed to open for takeaway orders, but I think the severity of the restrictions this time round is really now starting to sink in for a lot of people, and particularly that fact that you can't leave the house to go for a walk or exercise. It's weighing heavily on people who live alone or those who have pre-existing mental health conditions. They're taking that very seriously. Schools are also closed this time round, except to children of essential workers, but many schools have already sent out correspondence saying that they will be closed or they'll be having pupil-free days for the rest of the week and into next week. So that has a lot of people scratching their heads as well. And of course, the other big change this time is masks. We haven't really needed them here in Adelaide yet. So a lot of people are rushing to the chemist and the supermarket to grab one because from tomorrow they'll be required whenever we leave the house. Authorities are saying essential services will remain open. That's supermarkets, pharmacies, post offices, petrol stations and even the bottle shop. So they're stressing there is no need to panic by, but it doesn't appear that the message has gotten through.
Locked and loaded. Supermarkets around the state were inundated as people readied themselves for 6 days at home.
Had to go to the fruit and veg and wait for an hour to get through the queue.
And this is despite assurances that supermarkets would still be open through the lockdown.
It's no point panicking and rushing out to the shops and, buying up lots of toilet paper.
Nevertheless, that was clearly happening, and many seemingly decided alcohol would be a necessity as well, especially if your partner was living in quarantine at a Medi hotel.
Well, I'm actually getting the boys some beer. So there's 13 of them at Pepper's Hotel.
Masks are also in high demand, with some pharmacies taking the precaution of over-the-counter sales only. Health authorities say wearing a mask in public isn't mandatory yet, but you should wear one away from home where possible.
If you're going to go shopping, think about other people. Treat each other with respect and a bit of kindness. Everybody's in the same boat.
The limitations for midnight are severe in a bid to contain the rapidly reproducing strain of the virus found in Adelaide.
We are going hard and we are going early. Time is of the essence and we must act swiftly and decisively.
We don't have any time to wait.
South Australia have made their decision today on the basis that they don't want to be thinking in a week, I should have done something else.
For the next 6 days across South Australia, people have been ordered to stay at home. Essential workers will be exempted and one person will be allowed to leave home once a day to get food or essential supplies. But all regional travel will be shut down. Factories other than those for food or medical products will be closed. There'll be no weddings or funerals, and aged care facilities will be in lockdown as well. Pubs, restaurants, cafes, food courts and takeaway outlets will all be closed. Universities will be shut and schools and childcare services will only be able to open to the children of essential workers. For those watching the announcement, there was a mixture of shock and resignation.
Now I'm going to be stuck at home by myself for another at least seven days.
The only thing that'll concern me is if I don't get to go and see the grandkids.
For management, the realisation of what it would mean for business was confronting.
We've got an owner who's fantastic, but I guess it's just terrible.
The plan is for a 6-day lockdown, followed by 8 more days of restrictions. But all of that is dependent on whether the virus can be contained. Chris McLaughlin, ABC News.
Let's turn now to reporter Claire Campbell, who is at the Victoria Park Testing Centre. Claire, the Prime Minister's given his support to South Australia's effort.
He has, Jess. The Prime Minister says that this lockdown has been based on lessons learnt from past outbreaks and that the measures are precautionary and temporary. But the lockdown has drawn criticism from many, including in the funeral industry, which say a ban on all funerals from tomorrow is unprecedented and will cause major logistical issues down the track. The lockdown also appears to have had an impact on testing numbers. We're here at this testing clinic in Victoria Park where cars were lined up from 4 a.m. this morning. By 8 a.m, the queue spanned several kilometres down Fullerton Road, but almost as soon as the lockdown was announced, the cars disappeared. They are starting to pick up again now, and from tomorrow, coming out to a testing clinic to get a COVID test is still a valid reason to leave the house. This testing clinic at Victoria Park will stay open until midnight, and today several regional clinics were closed down to bring those staff to Adelaide to help bolster testing capabilities in the city. The advice is, if you develop symptoms, particularly if you've been at any of the 50 identified COVID hotspots, get tested.
This popular Western suburbs pizza shop is the latest hotspot. Anyone who ate at or bought or had a pizza delivered from the Woodville Pizza Bar since November 6 is ordered to isolate and get tested. Todd Girdler joined the long testing queues today after buying hot chips there a week ago.
I've got parents who are not always healthy. I'd hate to think that, our family contributed to this getting out.
Because they do a lot of Uber there as well.
That's exactly what the state's chief public health officer is worried about.
This is why we're putting in place, one of the reasons we're putting in place the restrictions.
A cleaner from the Peppers Medi Hotel picked up the virus from a hard surface and passed it on to the rest of her family. She also passed it on to 2 security guards from the same hotel. One of those security guards was also working part-time at the Woodville Pizza Bar. Coincidentally, a worker from another quarantine hotel, the Stanford, ordered a pizza and contracted the virus. Now, around Australia, mandatory testing of hotel quarantine staff will be enforced.
All states and territories have agreed that anyone with quarantine facilities, anyone working in those quarantine facilities will be tested at least weekly to make sure that we increase that surveillance.
The Stanford worker is one of 2 new cases detected today, with a further 7 suspected.
The positive cases have been linked, and that's a phenomenal effort.
The number of positive cases in the Parafield cluster now stands at 23, but authorities are worried about how fast this particular strain is spreading and its lack of symptoms.
It has a very, very short incubation period. That means when somebody gets exposed, it's taking 24 hours or even less for that person to become infectious to others.
Nearly 10,000 South Australians were tested yesterday. More pop-up stations are being set up and hours extended at existing testing sites, and extra staff have been called in.
We are also looking at bringing in resources from interstate because we're very good with our lab capacity, but it's actually getting through and doing all of the testing, and we need more people.
Contact tracing teams in Western Australia and New South Wales are also helping out, as well as the Australian Defence Force. Claire Campbell, ABC News, Adelaide.
Our reporter Richard Davies is at a cafe in Bowden in Adelaide's west. Richard, they're staying open late tonight. Why is that?
Well, just like most of us around the state today, Nutrition Republic was caught off guard by the strict lockdown and having to close up for 6 days. And being a cafe, like many other businesses right across the state, they've been preparing for a busy weekend ahead. So their fridges are stocked with fresh food, milk, you've got fresh bread, fresh coffee. And they were left with, well, what do you do with all that food and all that fresh produce if you can't open for 6 days? So what they've decided to do, they normally close early afternoon, so they've decided to stay open until 10 o'clock tonight to try and get rid of some of that food, to try and sell it to people so it's not all going to be wasted and thrown away. They've actually managed to offload a lot of their milk to the local supermarket because they had so much milk here that they weren't going to be able to use. But what's happened is a lot of people have gone to the supermarket and bought up the milk, so the supermarket was quite happy to have all that extra milk. But across the state, it's a similar story for many businesses who are in the same predicament. Everyone was just not expecting this sort of lockdown to come into place. But this business hopes to be back up and running within the next week. Of course, it's out of everyone's control. We have to wait and see if this circuit breaker is going to be successful. And hopefully, like many people across the state, we've got our fingers crossed that it will. Jess.
Thanks, Richard. Richard Davies reporting there. South Australia's Premier says the state has one shot to get ahead of the curve and prevent another wave of the virus in Australia. This cluster has similarities to the start of Victoria's second wave, but lessons have clearly been learned since then, and the state's being far less tolerant of cases than some other states. Here's our analyst, Casey Briggs.
The South Australian government's brought the hammer down hard and fast. 2 weeks of staying at home, with the first 6 days under the toughest set of rules that Australia's seen in this pandemic to date. This cluster is still relatively small, 22 confirmed cases plus another 7 suspected, and importantly, no mystery cases just yet. But authorities are worried about the speed of the spread. They're currently tracing contacts 5 links away from the cluster's original source. That's 5 generations in which individual cases, perhaps asymptomatic cases, could have been missed. And if chains of transmission have been missed, we wouldn't necessarily know it yet. So it's clear that this cluster has the potential to be explosive. And it also bears some similarities to the start of Victoria's second wave, with some differences. Back then, the virus escaped from hotel quarantine around about here, into security guards and cleaners, then into large households in working class parts of the city. 3.5 weeks later, the Victorian government started to reimpose restrictions in small stages. South Australia has acted faster and gone straight to much tougher restrictions in a matter of days. It looks a lot more like the New Zealand approach to this virus. Shorter, sharper lockdowns to try and get a control of this virus before the numbers get out of hand. And South Australia's had some record-breaking numbers of tests in the last 24 hours. Just 2 new infections found from more than 9,500 tests processed. With long lines seen again outside testing clinics today, let's hope we see numbers like this again into the future.